The Pacific Ocean, spanning nearly 9,000 miles, was far too wide for an airplane of the 1930s to cross in a single leap. But years earlier, Pan Am President Juan Trippe had wondered if a flying boat might be able to hopscotch across the ocean, touching down on a series of islands laid out like stepping stones to China. With the map spread out before him, Trippe could almost see the path. The long leg from San Francisco to Hawaii would be reachable by the big flying boats he was sure would be coming someday, and some 1,400 miles west of Hawaii was another U.S. possession, Midway. From China, the first stop for planes flying east would be the Philippines, and 1,500 miles east of that was U.S.-held Guam. But that left a gulf of more than 2,600 miles, as wide as the entire United States. Was there anything in between? There was. A U.S. possession called Wake Island. So tiny and obscure, it did not even appear on most maps.
And he winds up scouring the logs of the old clipper ships, and he begins to find mention of it here, mention of it there. Nobody had ever lived on it. There's no water on the place. There's nothing to live with.
It was only 2 square miles and rose only 12 feet above sea level at high tide. But Wake Island was right where he needed it to be, halfway between Midway and Guam. Without telling anyone, Trippe filed that information away for the day he might need it. Now, with the air route across the Atlantic blocked, that day had come.
Dutch, I need you to do something for me.
What is it?
I need you to find out everything you can about Midway and Wake Island.
The Pacific Islands.
That's right.
Trippe instructed Dutch Schildhauer, a former Navy pilot now on the Pan Am staff, to make inquiries at the Navy Department.
But be quiet about it.
He told Schildhauer, go down to Washington and snoop around. Don't let anybody know what you're doing.
Schildhauer's research confirmed that Midway would serve Pan Am's purposes.
It's been an undersea cable station for decades, so it's a known commodity. And there's a string of small islands pointing right at it from Hawaii, so finding it won't be difficult.
And what about Wake?
Wake is a bit of a mystery. Fortunately, a team of scientists paid a visit to the island about a decade ago.
The expedition report described a typical Pacific atoll surrounded by a coral reef. Most important, in the middle of the island was a sizable lagoon, offering much calmer water than the surrounding ocean.
A flying boat has to have flat water. If it landed in the open sea, the waves would break it to pieces, and it can't get up enough speed in rough water to take off. It had to be the lagoon.
And is it big enough to land a flying boat in there?
To be determined. The map makes it seem like it's long enough to land a plane, but we don't know how deep the water is or if there's any hazards lurking beneath the surface.
Is there any way to find out?
The only way to find out was to visit the island, but Trippe was unwilling to wait.
Juan, this lagoon is the key to the whole Pacific crossing.
If the lagoon didn't work, there was no stepping stone.
The Honorable Claude Swanson, Secretary of the Navy, Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. Secretary.
Despite the uncertainty about Wake, Trippe wrote the Secretary of the Navy to announce that Pan Am was ready to fly the Pacific.
There were all kinds of problems that he should have seen, and he probably should have canceled the whole thing till he had more answers. Not Juan Trippe. He didn't cancel a thing. Full speed ahead.
Trippe requested a 5-year lease on Wake Island, sight unseen, and landing rights on the other stepping stone islands where Pan Am would need to build air bases. He wrote to Postmaster General James Farley, asking if the post office would like to begin airmail service to Asia. The answer was a resounding yes. For President Roosevelt, Pan Am's Pacific plans were a heaven-sent answer to a nagging problem in that part of the world.
The U.S. Navy welcomed the presence of Pan American going across the Pacific for several reasons, but the biggest reason was the growing worry about the belligerence of the Japanese.
For more than a decade, Japan had been chafing at the terms of a post-World War I treaty, that limited the size of its navy. It had given notice that it would opt out of the treaty in 2 years and begin building up its fleet of warships. The bellicose Tokyo government had already overrun Manchuria, and there were suspicions Japan had violated the treaty by fortifying 3 chains of Pacific islands it had won from Germany after World War I. As early as 1923, U.S. General Billy Mitchell had warned that the Japanese could use their Pacific islands as staging areas for a surprise attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. But the U.S., leery of antagonizing the Japanese, didn't dare guard against such an attack by establishing bases on its own Pacific islands.
The U.S. still wanted to have a greater presence in that sector, but do it in a way that wouldn't draw the attention of the Japanese. And one way they could do that is actually by working with Juan Trippe.
Nobody can argue with commercial aviation out in the middle of the ocean. That's not military.
By developing an air service to China, Pan Am would establish an American presence all the way across the Pacific.
So Pan Am was, in a sense, kind of operating as a surrogate for the Navy in the Pacific at a time when actually having naval battleships stationed at these islands would have been seen by Japan as a provocation.
The U.S. Navy had almost no presence out there. There was no way of really determining what the Japanese were doing.
Pan Am's presence in the Pacific, in a sense, could serve as a kind of eyes and ears on Japan. And the Japanese government was keenly aware of this.
On learning of Pan Am's plans, the former commander of the Japanese Navy charged that American air routes, thrust into the Western Pacific, threatened Japan's first line of marine defense by passing right through the chains of islands the country had acquired after World War I.
They saw this ring of islands as their security fence. This gave them a barrier against Western intrusion, particularly American intrusion.
They didn't like the idea of American bases all across the Pacific. You didn't have to tell the Japanese that in time of war, any of those Pan Am bases can be used by the Navy.
Trippe was undeterred by Japanese objections. Here in the Pacific, as in Latin America, he would be an instrument of American foreign policy.
He is an arm of the U.S. government in a very real way.
Anxious to get the Pacific service underway, Trippe set out to build a skyway to Asia.
Claire,
Yes, Mr. Trippe?
get me Grooch.
In January 1935, he tapped veteran Pan Am hand Bill Grooch to lead an expedition to build landing facilities at the Steppingstone Islands along the route. In a book he later wrote about the adventure, Grooch described the huge quantities of supplies that were loaded aboard the freighter North Haven under his watchful eye.
Every steamer and freight train that arrived in San Francisco handed us cargo faster than we could handle it. Tractors, generators, dock timbers, and radio gear.
The North Haven was like a modern-day Ark. They had barges, they had launches, they had prefab buildings.
Never had a ship had such a cargo or complement of passengers. 2 complete villages, 5 air bases, a construction force of 74, and food to feed them for months.
To build the Pacific Airway, Grooch hired a mix of skilled technicians, construction workers, and college boys out for a lark.
It's one of the great adventures of their lifetimes. They were about to colonize a desert island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Yet Trippe authorized all this without knowing if crossing the Pacific was even possible.
Trippe did not yet have an airmail contract. He did not have an airplane capable of reaching the islands. He still didn't know whether Wake Island was usable. If any one of them didn't come through, he was finished. He was a gambler, and he was betting everything he had.
The plane that could cross the Pacific was supposed to have been delivered by now. But at Glenn Martin's Baltimore factory, construction on the giant M-130 flying boat was behind schedule. So Trippe turned to his old friend Igor Sikorsky and his latest aircraft. For all its innovations, the S-42 was a plane designed for the Atlantic. Its range was not up to the critical 2,400-mile first leg of the Pacific crossing. But now, With the Martin plane behind schedule, the S-42 was thrust into an unexpected role. Trippe sent one of the planes back to the Sikorsky factory to be stripped of its passenger fittings.
They turned it into a flying fuel tank to make that 2,400 miles to get to Hawaii.
And then they took it out of Miami out to the Atlantic Ocean and back again, over and over again, calculating the best fuel ratios, the most efficient speed, and so on.
The man Trippe chose to conduct these critical tests was pilot Ed Musick.
Musick didn't have the youthful charisma of a Lindbergh or any pizzazz of some of the famous racing pilots like Jimmy Doodle. He was a technician, and a very good one.
He absolutely was always by the book, and everything had to be just right, and it made the co-pilots crazy.
He was called Meticulous Musick by his peers for good reason, because he was so precise in everything he did.
On entering a plane, one former colleague said, Musick would almost draw the cockpit around his shoulders like an old shawl.
And then spend minutes getting everything just right, adjusting his seat fore and aft till his hands reached the yoke and the throttles at just the right angle. And finally, not till everything was to his satisfaction, he turned over his shoulder and told the engineer, "Start number 1."
Are you declaring an emergency, sir?
Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
On March 23, 1935, Musick lifted off for a final fuel test. He flew the S-42 from Miami to the Virgin Islands and back, over 17 hours and 2,600 miles without a stop. Trippe was satisfied he now had a plane that could make the trip to Hawaii.
Bill, it's a go.
The next day, he gave the order for the North Haven to set sail. When the ship reached Hawaii, the huge antenna masts for Pan Am's radio navigation station were offloaded, replaced by a ton of dynamite. Next stop, Midway.
And the problems arose immediately. They couldn't land.
Because the island was surrounded by a coral reef, the ship had to anchor 4 miles offshore and offload its cargo onto barges in the open sea.
Yeah, the crews on the barges were not seamen, so they had great difficulty keeping their feet as the barge did its dance.
The ship is bouncing up and down, and the boys scampering around underneath trying not to get killed by everything. One boy gets his fingers cut off.
All the while, several good-sized sharks glided about and looked us over. They gave every evidence of being hungry.
Once loaded, each barge was towed by motor launch through a shallow break in the reef to the shore, where the crew unloaded it piece by piece onto a dock they had built. One of the first things to come ashore was a tractor, which the crew then used to drag the cargo on sleds across the sand. A critical early assignment fell to engineer Bill Taylor. As a construction crew erected Pan Am's radio navigation towers, Taylor climbed up a rickety platform and calibrated the direction finder by taking sightings on the circling North Haven, as others took radio bearings on the ship from the DF shack below. The island's tent city offered a few creature comforts, like solar-heated showers and movie nights. But the work was exhausting. Every morning it's up at 4:30 and work till dark, one crew member wrote his sweetheart back home. Today I rode, hammered, pushed, pulled, lifted and lowered, drove the launch and gazed into the hot sun. I'm tired. Compounding the construction challenge, Midway was a national bird sanctuary, so the crew had to take great care not to harm the island's feathered residents, especially the Laysan albatross.
They're nicknamed Goonie birds, and they're big. Their wingspan can be as much as 6 feet. And they are afraid of nothing on the ground, so they're all over the place.
The adult Goonies would collect in groups on the sand and go through this queer ritual that had all the earmarks of a tribal dance. And this performance would go on endlessly all over the place.
Bill Taylor remembers the problems they posed for workmen.
The mother goonie flies out to sea every day, catches some fish, and then flies back and feeds its young. The young goonie stays exactly in the same spot, because if he leaves, he doesn't get fed.
The young goonies wouldn't budge even for a tractor. And we'd have to send a guard ahead that would pick up the youngsters and put them to the side. And the minute the chick was released, he'd scuttle right back.
The birds slowed, but could not stall the construction team's progress. Day by day, the first of Pan Am's mid-Pacific air bases moved closer to completion. Meanwhile, Music was flying Sikorsky's stripped-down S-42 across Mexico to Acapulco and up the coast to San Francisco Bay. Pan Am had established landing facilities on the east side of the bay, in Alameda, and erected a set of radio navigation towers there.
They start doing practice runs up and down the Pacific coast, making landmarks, plotting again fuel consumption.
All of this in preparation for the biggest test of all, a 2,400-mile survey flight from San Francisco to Hawaii.
This was going to be the very first time that a transport airplane had made such a great distance.
The whole country is watching this. Every place the thing's set down, there's tens of thousands of people there watching.
When word got out that Music had made a blind landing, relying only on his radio direction finder, the newspapers proclaimed Pan Am ready for the Pacific. But not everyone was so sure.
When Trippe announced his plan to cross the Pacific, there were plenty of critics, so-called experts, stepping forward to explain why this was not feasible, why it was too dangerous.
True, a team of Navy pilots had flown to Hawaii the year before, showing it could be done.
But Pan Am was proposing something altogether different. To many in the aviation community, regular service across the Pacific seemed like a foolhardy gamble. Information about weather patterns in the Pacific was scant, and the navigational challenges were even more formidable.
When you fly the Pacific, there's 2,400 miles that you've got to go, and there is nothing but water.
If your navigation is off by the tiniest degree, your fuel runs out, you crash, you're never heard from again. The margin for error is minute.
Many people believed that it couldn't be done. In fact, when Juan Trippe proposed a route across the Pacific to his own board of directors, they were like, "Are you kidding me?"
Several of his board members took exception and resigned.
There was a huge number of people that thought this was just an absolute folly on the part of Pan American.
On the eve of the survey flight, the government's director of aeronautical research approached Trippe. He feared that an accident on the Pacific route would set American aviation back years.
And he tells Trippe, "I'll announce that it can't be done for safety reasons, so you can get out of it then."
Trippe declined, assuring him that Pan Am was ready. At 4 p.m. on April 16th, Music taxied the S-42 down the bay and pointed her nose west. Hour after hour, the plane passed over steamships en route to Hawaii or San Francisco, each ship serving as a checkpoint along its flight path. When they landed safely at Pearl Harbor after 18 hours and 37 minutes, they had cut 6 hours off the record set by Navy flyers the year before.
The return flight didn't go quite as smoothly.
Music had no idea what the winds aloft would be. Nobody else did either.
Winds in the northern hemisphere normally blow from the west, so eastbound pilots can often count on the tailwind to speed their progress. But on this flight, the winds were blowing in the opposite direction.
He's got headwinds, and they become incredibly hard.
A plane has one speed through the air, but its forward progress, or ground speed, depends on what the wind is doing.
When the wind is behind you, you have a tailwind, you're faster. When the wind is on your nose, it's a headwind, it's kind of like swimming upstream, you'll be slower. So you can have a really significant difference in your ground speed depending on what the wind was doing.
Musick didn't realize just how much trouble he was in until nightfall, when navigator Fred Noonan could use the stars to get a fix on the plane's position.
And he comes forward and he says, look at this. We're making 96 miles an hour maximum. And they all start to sweat it out. By an airplane's standards, they're making almost no progress at all.
Back in Alameda, Pan Am Communications Director Hugo Leuteritz and the wives of the crew members nervously tracked the flight's progress.
They've run into some headwinds.
And back east, Trippe, Sikorsky, and Chief Engineer Andre Priester followed the events by phone.
They should have landed by now.
Headwinds, really strong.
From time to time, those ferocious headwinds died down for a minute or swung to one side or the other, but they always came back. And it was like a hand holding the plane up in the middle of the ocean, holding it back.
Still no sign of them. Noonan estimates they're at least an hour away.
And the fuel?
They're doing everything they can to stretch it.
Aboard the plane, flight engineer Vic Wright had set the engines to wring every last mile out of the gas. But after 18 hours in the air, there was still no sign of the coast.
They pressed on, and they were an hour late, and they were 2 hours late.
In Alameda, Wright's wife finally got up the nerve to ask,
How long can they stay in the air?
About 21 hours. Don't worry. They'll make it.
Musick kept changing altitudes. It became so close that he was down to half an hour's fuel, not sure whether or not they could even make it to the West Coast.
They're gonna make it. Juan, they've spotted the headlands. Should be down in 15 minutes.
They're back.
They're gonna be here in 15 minutes.
Thank God.
Finally, the S-42 emerged from a cloud bank, settled down on the bay, and taxied to the Alameda ramp. The flight had taken 20 hours and 59 minutes. In a dockside interview, Musick described the flight as routine.
Well, the first thing to ask you is what kind of a trip did you have?
Fine. Trip was excellent in every respect.
Over and back?
Over and back, yes.
The truth was, they had come perilously close to disaster. As the rest of the crew filed off, Vic Wright stayed behind to measure how much gas was left.
And he says those tanks were barely damp out at the bottom. We didn't have enough fuel to go once around the bay.
If the S-42 had not made it back, it would have been a huge setback for Juan Trippe's Pacific plans.
It would have ruined Pan Am, ruined Trippe, and probably killed a lot of those people.
But the plane had made it. Just. Pan Am had flown the longest leg of the Pacific Airway under the most challenging conditions, and both plane and crew had proven up to the task. Still ahead were the first flights to the 4 remaining Pacific stepping stones where Pan Am's men were building air bases. By this time, the North Haven had made its way from Midway to Wake Island. Because of the prevailing winds, the ship had to anchor south of the wishbone-shaped island. Pan Am's plan was to build the base on Wilkes, the nearest of the 3 islets that make up Wake. But as soon as they landed, they could see Wilkes was flood-prone and unsuitable. The village and radio station would have to be built on higher ground, more than a mile from the landing site, across the lagoon on the northern islet, Peel Island.
How do you get your stuff, the launch and the barge and the rest of it, across that arm of the island into the lagoon.
They began by hauling the cargo on their backs, dragging it across rocks and coral, and ferrying it across the lagoon in rowboats. As readers back home learned, the progress was agonizingly slow and painful. Then, Expedition Chief Bill Gruch had a brainstorm.
I remember we brought along 2 sets of automobile tires that we planned to use for a baggage cart. Inspecting those wheels, I noticed a deep, wide groove that suggested they would ride a rail.
With the tractor leveling trees and moving boulders to clear a roadbed, the crew built what they called the world's shortest railroad. It was only 200 yards long, but each carload could carry up to 2 tons of freight down the gentle slope to the lagoon, saving the men many days of backbreaking work. Gruch next turned his attention to the narrow channel between Wilkes and Wake.
I became convinced that with good luck, we could shoot a barge across the reef at high tide and work it through Wilkes Channel into the lagoon.
To deepen the channel, a dozen men were put to work tossing rocks and coral aside. When the right moment came, the barge, with a motor launch perched on top, rode a swell across the reef and into the channel, with 40 men pushing and pulling, and a little help from the tractor when it ran aground. They got the barge into the lagoon. Now they could ferry big loads of cargo from the railhead across to Peel. Despite these well-chronicled triumphs, the endless work wore on the Wake Island crew. We're isolated on a little mid-Pacific isle over 1,000 miles from any other land, one wrote. Every man among us has a home, maybe a wife, a sweetheart, babies they love, mothers, fathers, all thousands of miles away. How are they? Are they safe? Are they true? I want to go home. While the construction proceeded on Peel, others turned their attention to the lagoon where the flying boats were to land. The news they radioed back to Alameda was not good.
The lagoon was studded with coral heads that came up in many places almost to the surface. Those things will rip the bottom out of a flying boat. You can't land on this lagoon.
To make the lagoon serviceable, the team would have to blast out the coral heads one at a time, using the dynamite they had picked up in Hawaii.
They had a college boy named Bill Malahy who had been a swimmer on the Columbia University swimming team, and he became the underwater demolition expert.
He had been given the job of one by one diving and dynamiting each of those coral heads.
He would swim down, attach dynamite to each coral head, get back on board and blow it up. Sometimes one blast was enough to do away with the coral head, and sometimes it wasn't, and you had to do it again.
It was arduous, dangerous work, and still without any promise that it was going to be successful. Could they, in fact, carve out a long enough marine runway to accommodate a flying boat? They didn't know that.
After 3 months and 100 coral heads, they were barely halfway across the lagoon. But Trippe was unwilling to wait any longer.
Claire?
Yes, Mr. Trippe?
Get me Sullivan in Alameda.
Yes, sir.
He gave the order for the S-42 to take off from California as the blasting continued. The lonely men who'd been marooned on Wake Island were excited about the plane's imminent arrival. But would the marine runway be long enough for pilot Rod Sullivan to make a landing?
Sullivan was the first flying boat captain to peer down on Wake Island. And what Sullivan saw down there he didn't like.
From the air, Sullivan can see all the coral heads. He can see how short the runway is, and he decides he's going to try to side slip in.
There was a crosswind blowing right straight across the so-called runway. So his first pass, slipping with one wing down into the crosswind, he put it down too fast, had to go around cursing all the way. One can only imagine the tension in Sullivan's cockpit. There's no other choice. There is no other alternate field within 1,000 miles of Wake Island. Came back around, put it down this time, still fast because there was no headwind to slow the speed of the aircraft over the water. And managed to slow it to a stop before hitting a coral on the far end. And Sullivan, being Sullivan, he was a rough man. Rough with people, rough with airplanes. Storms out of the cockpit, cursing all the way up into the mess hall where this bedraggled crew was waiting for him. Welcome to Wake Island.
But back in New York, Juan Trippe was pleased. He knew the landings would get easier as the runway got longer. The important thing was that his enormous bet was about to pay off. Wake Island, the key to the Pacific crossing, the stepping stone he'd banked on sight unseen, was going to work out. The North Haven would go on to make stops in Guam and the Philippines. After 4 months at sea, the ship returned to San Francisco, its mission complete. The Skyway to Asia was ready for service. Back east, Glenn Martin's M130 was finally ready.
The M130, when it arrived, was in a class all by itself. It was the biggest airliner ever built in America at that time, and it was a totally different craft from anything anybody'd seen before.
Trippe had asked Martin to build a plane with a top speed of 180 miles an hour, a cruising speed of 150, and it would need to take off with a weight of 52,000 pounds.
These were all astonishing figures for this day. From the beginning, as they're building this monster, people thought, this is crazy. The chief test pilot for Martin, he said that everybody said to him, this thing's never going to get off the water. I don't know what you guys are thinking of.
The M130 not only flew, but easily passed all its flight tests.
It was a beautiful, graceful airplane. Technologically, it was a marvel. It was the first airliner that could carry a greater load than the airplane weighed. Plus, it had a range of over 3,000 miles. It catapulted America and Pan American into the forefront of aviation technology.
At the unveiling ceremony in October 1935, Juan Trippe revealed the plane would be named the China Clipper.
The launching of the China Clipper, biggest plane ever built in America.
After an American sailing ship that had crossed the Pacific 100 years earlier.
Number one aviator inspects number one airplane, Colonel Lindbergh.
Charles Lindbergh, whose role with Pan Am had diminished after the kidnapping and murder of his son, gave his stamp of approval to the plane. But it was Ed Musick who took the controls, retracing the path he'd taken earlier in the S-42.
Want the whole thing over again?
In San Diego, Musick glumly shot and reshot the arrival ceremony for the newsreel cameras.
He abhorred publicity. He abhorred the flash bulbs and the handshakes and the people clamoring for autographs.
Captain Musick, welcome to San Diego. Congratulations on your wonderful trip.
Thank you ever so much. It's a courtesy extending us this allowing us to come to the station.
He hated being on stage. Could you say something great, you know? He says, and he's up there and says, we're very glad to be here.
The flight over here was uneventful.
He was the bane of the public relations department. They begged him, send us something about the sunset. So he said he would. He's radioed back, sunset, 0639 GMT. That was it.
He's comfortable only in the cockpit of an airplane. He didn't want anything to do with acclaim or fame, but he got it anyway, and it was about to get even bigger.
Good afternoon, everyone, from the rim of the Pacific Ocean. The occasion of this broadcast is the inauguration of the first trans-Pacific airmail service by Pan American Airways China Clipper.
On November 22nd, 1935, more than 20,000 people jammed onto the grounds of the Pan American Airways terminal in Alameda. And 100,000 more watched from surrounding communities.
All over San Francisco Bay, they're hanging out of windows, they're watching this, they're enthralled.
Directly to our left.
Around the world, millions followed the events via the live radio broadcast reaching 4 continents.
CBS and NBC are on the air an hour before the plane takes off, and they're describing the scene.
The China Clipper in front of us weighs 25 1/2 tons, but she's built, you see, to cut the air without even so much as a rivet to catch it.
Everybody was tuned to their radios. Everybody that could was out there looking.
The launch of China Clipper was a massive public spectacle. In a sense, it was akin to the rocket launches of the 60s.
And in fact, not until NASA's attempts to orbit the Earth or to send men to the moon was so much public attention focused on a single planned aerospace event.
Pan Am's public relations department had prepared an elaborate ceremony to mark the loading of 100,000 pieces of mail aboard the plane.
Now, early today, an old overland stagecoach drawn by 6 horses made the trip to the Clipper's moorage here as a salute from the old to the new.
Part of the mystique and the attraction of this event, I think, was the implied danger of the journey itself.
Everybody who was there celebrating remembered when airmail pilots were dying on a regular basis just flying over land. And here's Juan Trippe proposing to fly the Pacific, for heaven's sake.
The Pacific was still a great unknown factor. In Americans' imagination, this was a huge void. The Martin M130, this great airplane, was mostly untested. It had never flown over a great body of water.
You're aiming at a tiny speck of land in the middle of a vast trackless ocean. You have to be absolutely perfect or you'll die.
It was a great adventure that could possibly end disastrously. Nobody knew yet.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you are to hear from J.T. Trippe, president of the Pan American Airways system.
It is significant and appropriate that the first scheduled air service over a major ocean route extending 1/3 of the way around the world is being started under the auspices of the American government by an American company and in charge of American captains and crews.
Trippe very astutely portrayed this as a distinctly American event.
There's even a bunch of Boy Scouts with a flag that was 120 feet long. The Trippe saw to it was laid out there so everybody could see this is American.
And it's important to consider that this occurred at the height of the Depression. This is 1935.
America at that time was really at its nadir. The Depression had affected everybody and everything.
Unemployment is still very high in the mid-1930s. The country's in trouble.
And now along comes an American success story. This remarkable airplane has been built by American industry, American workers.
So this was not only a thrilling technological spectacle, but it was, in a sense, something that gave people a feeling of hope, a feeling of progress.
Postmaster General Farley, whose own department.
One of those avidly following the preparations for the flight was President Roosevelt, who had asked Postmaster General James Farley to deliver a letter on his behalf.
Please convey to the people of the Pacific Coast deep interest and heartfelt congratulations of an air-minded sailor. Even at this distance, I thrill to the wonder of it all. Pan American Mid-Ocean Air Base number 2, Midway Island, standing by for orders. Pan American Airways Mid-Ocean Air Base number 3, Wake Island, standing by for orders.
One by one, the Pan Am bases on the 5 stepping stone islands signaled their readiness.
Number 4, Guam, standing by for orders.
China Clipper, are you ready? Captain Music, you have your sailing orders. Cast off and depart for Manila in accordance therewith.
All 4 engines are started. And Music taxis out into the bay. The band is playing the Star Spangled Banner. Bombs and rockets are shooting overhead. Finally, Music pushes the 4 throttles up and the airplane slowly accelerates.
And Music goes down the bay, and the plane is so heavily loaded that he can't get it off the water.
Music finally got the ship to rise.
It's lifted off to about 50 feet, and that's as high as it could get.
And ahead of him is the Oakland Bay Bridge, which was just being built.
The roadway didn't exist yet, so it was this virtual net metal hanging in the sky there. Music realized, gosh, we're not going to clear it.
So Music, the right man for the time, made a critical decision. Instead of trying to climb over the bridge, which the China Clipper was reluctant to do, he nudged the nose down and flew under it. And right behind him came this entourage of little airplanes carrying reporters and press people, thinking this is part of the script.
And they all go under the bridge also.
Only a few people on the shore, holding their breath, knew the truth, that this was almost a catastrophe. It was not part of the plan.
Slowly gaining altitude, Music swung the plane by the San Francisco waterfront, where a great crowd of people was watching. Then over the Golden Gate Bridge, also under construction at the time. The spectators kept their eyes on the Clipper until it became a speck on the horizon. The media that had breathlessly chronicled the Clipper's preparations now followed her progress west. Greeted with leis at Pearl Harbor, the crew took on Thanksgiving turkeys with all the fixings for the lonely men at Pan Am's island bases. With Glenn Martin's M130 performing flawlessly, the crew arrived in Midway right on schedule. Between Midway and Wake, Music flew through clouds thick as cotton. But with the help of Leuteritz's Adcock antennas, he hit the tiny island on the nose. In Guam, the crew encountered the flight's only hitch. Someone had forgotten to take the international date line into account.
So they had to wait a day in Guam in order to arrive in Manila when the crowd was waiting for them.
Six days later, after departing San Francisco, they landed in Manila Harbor to a massive celebration.
There was a crowd that was greater than the one they'd left in San Francisco.
More than 200,000 Filipinos had come out to greet the airplane.
And all around Manila Bay, people hanging from the windows and tooting the car horns and so on.
A revolution in transportation. It's welcomed as the first great event for the independent Philippines.
Music fought through the crowd to deliver the first trans-Pacific airmail letter, from President Roosevelt to President Quezon.
I want to congratulate you, Captain Music, and you gentlemen, for your successful flight.
They put him in front of dozens of microphones, and they waited for this great description and colorful account of this glorious success.
Music did his best to stay in character. Asked how the trip was, he said,
Flight was without incident.
Without incident.
Even so, his Filipino host showered Music with gratitude at a banquet and parade.
Music was thrust into the spotlight, decorated, hugged, hand-grabbed.
And this time, Music even liked it. There are pictures of him grinning, which Music proves he liked it.
The maiden flight of the China Clipper would make this reluctant hero one of the most famous pilots in the world. But to the newly independent Philippines, the flight represented something else, an end to the isolation they had long felt from the rest of the world.
Some historians use the phrase the tyranny of distance. People lived very limited lives, largely because they were stuck in one place for most of their existence on this planet.
You have swept away forever the distance which from the beginning of time has separated the great continent of America from the islands of the Pacific.
These people felt that he had brought them into the rest of the world. These are emotions we don't understand because that world doesn't exist anymore.
This was a tremendous technological achievement, and it also sent a signal to people that their lives need not be bounded by what they had once thought of as unimaginable distance.
By the time the China Clipper arrived back in San Francisco, Music, of course, was a huge celebrity, but so was the China Clipper. She became a superstar. Warner Brothers produced China Clipper, starring Humphrey Bogart as Music, and Pat O'Brien played a version of Juan Trippe.
I'm going to fire Anders and put a landing on the job.
Now, wait a minute, Dave, you can't do that.
One of the great lines from the movie was towards the end when Bogart, playing music, climbs out of the cockpit after having just flown through a typhoon, and he says, referring to his boss.
I was just thinking how swell it would have been if he'd said thanks.
And that got a laugh from everybody who knew Juan Trippe.
But there was no denying what Trippe had accomplished.
To go from a 90-mile crossing from Key West to Havana in 1927 to crossing the widest ocean in the world at the widest point 8 years later is impossible to believe.
And it can all be attributed to the vision and the obsession of this one man.
A year after the Pacific crossing, Pan Am began carrying passengers to Manila, building hotels on the stepping stone islands to accommodate them in comfort. And in 1937, Pan Am extended China Clipper service to Hong Kong, completing the link to the Asian mainland. That same year, Trippe finally overcame the logjam in Europe, introducing service across the North Atlantic. Pan Am's New York-London route forged the last link in a chain of airways encircling the globe.
It made faraway places accessible to the layman, something that we take for granted now, but was inconceivable in 1935.
Just 15 years earlier, aviation had been for barnstormers and daredevils. Now, passengers flew to Europe on Pan Am's newest flying boat, the Boeing 314, whose comforts surpassed even those of the China Clipper. There were 5 staterooms with seats that converted to sleeping berths, and a tail suite for VIPs.
The public seeing these glamorous pictures of people having a hot meal with china and crystal and a steward serving it in flight, it creates a totally different perception of aviation travel.
Many people who never would have flown in the 20s are quite willing to fly. They see it as a routine and safe form of mass transportation, which of course is where we are today.
By speeding critical parts, business correspondence, and people to their destinations, the transoceanic service accelerated the process of globalization.
Aviation helped bind the world together into a tighter community, just as the telegraph and the railroad had done before, and just as the jet engine, television, and the internet would do in the future.
The advent of aviation, and particularly the ability to cross the Pacific, was yet another technological step that effectively shrunk the world.
Destinations that once took weeks to get to by ship could now be reached in days.
But I think the real legacy is in the way it transformed our understanding of geography.
For hundreds of years, people's image of the world had been based largely on the Mercator projection, a map that flattened the round Earth in a particular way.
And essentially what that did was to give Americans a sense of comfortable distance between North America and Europe on the one hand and Asia on the other.
But soon after Pan Am began flying the oceans, cartographers began depicting the world in a new way.
Those maps give you the sensation of being a pilot floating above the terrain. There was no isolation anymore. What you have is a sense that the United States is now inextricably linked to the rest of the world.
That sense of connection helped revive an idea that had been around since the dawn of aviation, that by exposing people to different cultures, the airplane would make the world a more peaceful place.
Air transport is making possible a community spirit among nations. No longer are the oceans a barrier. The world is a neighborhood. We know the other fellow's problems, and he knows ours.
Aviation will bring peace to the world. When people travel, they get to know other people. They don't go to war against them. That's Trippe's vision.
But the same technology that gave us access to other cultures also left us vulnerable. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked not only Pearl Harbor, but each of the stepping stones Pan Am had used to cross the Pacific. Even with the Pacific airway severed, Pan Am would play a key role in the American war effort. The company had signed secret contracts to establish air bases throughout South America.
Pan Am flew supplies from the United States via these airports in South America across the Atlantic Ocean to North African Allied bases. And this supply chain played a key role in Allied victories in 1942.
In crossing the oceans and establishing air bases around the world, Pan Am was writing a blueprint for a new kind of empire. Earlier imperial powers had established colonies and ruled over their people.
That's not the way we did it. We had bases around the world, and those bases were increasingly linked by airplanes.
Just as Britain's 19th century global dominance had been founded on naval power, the United States' 20th century global dominance would be founded on air power.
Pan Am was very much part of the early construction of that network of bases from which, to this very day, we still project American power.
The United States would have an empire of the air. It wouldn't conquer other places. It would be an empire of transportation and commerce and not of colonization.
The bigger, faster transport planes developed during the war would be the foundation of future civil aviation, supporting a post-war travel boom and rendering the flying boat obsolete. All three of the flying boats built by Glenn Martin, including the China Clipper, had crashed by the end of the war. All of Igor Sikorsky's big flying boats also met their ends, most notably when an S-42 piloted by Ed Musick exploded on approach to Samoa in 1938, killing all aboard. With the era of the flying boat coming to an end, Igor Sikorsky turned to one of his childhood dreams.
He had a chance to live his life again, to build a machine without knowing if it would fly and get in there and push the throttle forward.
At the age of 50, Sikorsky began a new career, becoming a leading designer of helicopters, the craft for which he's known today. Hugo Leuteritz left Pan Am after the war and formed a company to make aerial navigation equipment. Today, all flying machines find their way using navigational systems that rely on radio.
We routinely now fly in the clouds in poor weather, close to the ground, and then we do this hundreds of thousands of times a day all over the world.
Juan Trippe continued to be a catalyst for technological innovation, prodding the aviation industry into adopting jet engines and large transports like the 747.
He was always pushing for bigger, better, faster, safer planes.
Trippe retired in 1968 and died in 1981. A decade later, the airline he had built into a dominant force in world aviation went out of business. But the path blazed by Trippe, Lindbergh, Sikorsky, and Leuteritz remains open and ever more vital. Air travel knits the world together. Every day, 5 million passengers board 34,000 international flights, many of them across the oceans.
To learn more about the people, stories, and technologies behind Across the Pacific, please visit our website at www.acrossthepacific.net.